Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Good Ideas webinar. I appreciate y'all's patience as we worked on some logistical issues. Senator Chairman Larry Taylor is joining us this afternoon to talk about what happened during our last legislative session. Sir, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Veronica. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, so Chairman Taylor, he is a lifelong Texan. He's a graduate of Baylor University. Go Bears. He has been a state senator since 2013, and before that, he served in the Texas House from 2003 to 2012. Do I have all my years about right, sir?
That sounds about right. It's
Yeah.
hard to remember all that.
So now I know that you are super busy, and so especially given that you guys are about to go through a special all over again beginning tomorrow, so I really appreciate you joining us to give us a rundown of what happened. To start off, you've been on the education committee now for several sessions, have served as chair since 2015. Can you please tell me what is your motivation, your passion for continuing to serve in this area?
Well, I first got involved in the legislature based on some issues that were going on. I'm kind of a fixer. My when someone points out something that's wrong, I want to go in there and try to fix it. And 10 years in the House, I never was on the education committee. And you kind of tend to think of public education based on your own experience. And my kids were doing fine. My own personal experience was good. But when I got on the education committee, when I first got to the Senate, I found out that's really not true everywhere. And we were falling behind in a lot of areas, particularly for our low income students. So I've been inspired to get to work on that and make sure, for the future of Texas, when you find out that our largest demographic in Texas, as far as our student body, is now students who qualify for a free and reduced lunch. That's 60% of our student body. And then you also find out that's our fastest growing demographic. You see that doesn't bode well if we don't change our history of how well we've educated those kids. And unfortunately, we've not done a really good job with that population. So that's really what I'm in. I see every one of these students. I don't just see students. I see family trees, because in this country, we're very blessed that if you get a good education and a good job, to those kids, their kids won't be in the same situation that they may have grown up in. So when I look at bringing every one of these kids that typically and historically have been somewhat left behind in many cases, when you bring them up to speed and give them the same opportunity with a good education, they have the opportunity to succeed. And frankly, it's going to help us as a state, and it's going to help each one of these students individually, for them and their families. So I have a passion for it. I love kids already. But then to be able to give kids, every opportunity to give a good education wherever they are in the state of Texas. I just try to meet the kids where they are and give them the best opportunity to get the best education in the way that best meets their needs.
I appreciate that, sir. Certainly your commitment is demonstrated through your actions as a lawmaker over the past several years. And before we get into specifics of what y'all did this last legislative session, I'd like to talk a little bit just, what was it like this last legislative session? You guys, the session began during a worldwide pandemic. Then, during session, Winter Storm Uri hit that impacted millions of Texans. Just logistically, what was it like for you as a lawmaker having to navigate through those challenges?
Well, I've been there. At the end of this term will be 20 years, but I talked to members who've been there for 40 and 50 years, and they've never seen anything like this. This was by far the strangest session as far as logistics and the dynamics of what was going on. Every session has its own personality, has issues that kind of pop up that no one expected, but this one was really off the charts. Dealing with COVID to start with, everyone expected this to be a very slow session.
Mhm.
One, because we were very slow getting started, because that was in January of 2020. If you remember, we were still kind of not sure where we're going with all this. People were very hesitant to getting together, the protocol. So we were setting aside whole committee hearing rooms just for overflow for committee hearing rooms. So you were able to have half the number of committee meetings that you normally would have in a session. So we expected this to be a lower volume session, and really, coming into session, the economy was not doing well. The initial numbers we were getting from the comptroller back in July, we were facing deficits. Fortunately, as the economy opened up, our budget numbers got better, so we weren't having to face that. But it was certainly challenging. And then you get in once we finally started getting almost ready to get going, then we have Winter Storm Uri, and
Mhm.
like knocked out a week of legislative session at that time. So you normally have this kind of nice gradual get into the peak activity where we went from this to this, and it was just already going 90 miles an hour with no transition, no opportunities really to get together with members of the House. A lot of time we have social opportunities with different county days now where you get together and get to visit with members of the House to get some one develop relationships with some of the new members, but just get a chance to kind of get a feel for what's going on their side and have that communication. And we just didn't have that opportunity this session. So it set up for a very strange session. At the end of the day, we did get some very important things done, but it was certainly different and trying and challenging. I was glad when it was over, but then finding out it's not over, it's not quite as satisfying.
Not quite yet, not quite yet.
No.
I know, despite those challenges, and also despite the fact that the prior legislative session was a very significant session for public education and everything that y'all did around HB3. I think there was this thought that that with the pandemic going on and this, with last legislative session being such a big education session, that this year it wouldn't be that big on education. But as you mentioned, that actually was not the case. There was some pretty significant legislation that was passed that impacts public education, students, schools. Tell us a little bit about, some of the highlights of those big pieces that moved through and passed into law.
Well, Veronica, if you remember, we really did have a big session, the previous session, particularly with House Bill 3 and a number of other issues. We knew we were going to have to fulfill the commitments of House Bill 3 with the spending and all that. And that was very much going to be very difficult when we were looking at the budget picture that we saw back in July and all that. That got better and better as we got closer. We were able to do that. But there's also a lot of House, when you do a major bill like that, 300 plus pages, very complex, there's always cleanup. There's things that, in the drafting or whatever, you find errors and unintended consequences. So there was a cleanup bill, but of course, with COVID, all that was compounded. House Bill 3, the basic premise is kind of what I've talked about. It was about closing the gaps for our low income students. Well, then here comes COVID, and the gaps just got worse. And the issues with all the kids going virtual, just programs that were stood up overnight, uh, obviously caused a lot of things that we had to work on, and we'll probably work on again next session. But the House bill cleanup was a big deal. Having the funding to make sure we fulfilled our budgetary commitments that we made with House Bill 3. We actually increased funding for public education another $2 billion for this coming budget cycle. So we fulfilled and we continue to maintain the increases for that. But the reading academies we'd set up in House Bill 3, we had to extend the deadlines for those. Some career tech funding weights for our small and mid-sized districts weren't handled properly in House Bill 3 the way it was drafted. It had some issues. We cleaned that up because obviously we want to have career tech available for all of our students, because those are great avenues for many students who aren't going to college, or that's not their main goal to start with, to have them get the kind of career skills they need. The compensatory education that goes for our low income students, we actually made a slight change for our homeless students,
Mhm.
that they get the maximum allotment under that comp ed. And, of course, we continued to work on our P-TECH programs. But the new things are learning acceleration. One of the things we found out at the beginning of session, and this was shocking, this is actually prior to COVID, but about 20 some odd percent of our students each year, grade below grade level. And of those students, several years later, like 4% have actually been caught up. So what we're doing is obviously not working. Uh, that needs to be addressed. And that was pre-COVID. And of course, with COVID, we're going to have a whole lot more students below grade level. So we've got to make some major changes. COVID has given us some opportunities to learn about some enhancements as far as virtual education. For most students, it's not the best situation that they're all virtual. There are a small percentage of students who actually thrived and did better under virtual. You know, Different scenarios. Some kids have emotional issues or stress issues, anxiety disorders, those kind of things. And some kids, just think and do better that way. They don't do well in a class, but we want those kids to get educated. Very bright students, who knows what kind of talents. We want to make sure we meet those kids. But the accelerated learning is going to be very important. Bringing retired teachers back to help with tutoring, so we can have closer, smaller ratios of student teacher to student ratios. By having our retired, what better group to come in and help in a temporary time like this than our retired teachers? So we made sure we made that there were no penalties for retired teachers coming back to help with tutoring. And they volunteered to help with that program. You work with the Retired Teachers Association. So there's just a lot of things having to do with COVID now, not just continue what we worked on House Bill 3, but COVID has just made many issues even worse. So just a lot of issues like that working on. And education, during COVID, during the interim, we were working constantly on how to get our schools open, what were the best protocols, and how was our virtual education going. Obviously we've seen now it's not going very well for most of our students, and so we really need to get those kids back in face-to-face classes.
So I know that certainly at one point before session began, there was a question as to whether or not the state would be in a position to meet the commitments that it made prior session through House Bill 3 and continue the funding that was appropriated last session. And as you mentioned, the legislature did in fact meet that commitment, as well as implement additional programs. We talked a little bit about some of the initiatives passed that will help support students and the impact that COVID-19, the pandemic, has had on learning. So you mentioned accelerated learning. Can you tell us a little bit, what does that mean?
Well, first of all, it's identifying the kids that are behind. And so we did do the STAR test. If you'll remember, there was a lot of question about that. There's not really any accountability measures attached to it, but we need to know where the kids are. And so when you have a child, and this is going to go from this point forward, who doesn't test at grade level for on the STAR test, they're not meeting standards. They're going to have no longer be having the accountability measures like being held back or those types of things, or having to take the test over and over again. What we are going to do is uh, establish committees, kind of like for a special needs student. They have a committee that gets together. They're art. What are they going to do? How do they help these kids get the education they need? We're going to do that for our students who are grading below grade level. So there's going to be accelerated learning and other measures brought in, whether it's extended school days, longer school years, more intense tutoring for these students to help get them caught up. Because like I said, this before COVID, what we were doing was not working. So accelerated learning, COVID is kind of, for all of our students, has been an issue, accelerated learning, but this is going to be something that's going to continue from this point forward to make sure we don't have these kids get left behind.
That's one of the, with the accelerated learning, the ability for retired teachers to be able to come back and, provide education to our students that are needing that extra support. Those are some of the initiatives that were passed this session. Were there any opportunities that were missed that would have helped support students?
Well, there's a couple things. One was one that I spent a lot of time on. My staff worked on very hard, and it had to do with virtual education. Prior to COVID, we had our statewide virtual school network, which was down to about 6 districts or entities that were actually providing statewide virtual options for students. During COVID, every district stood up a virtual option. Many don't want to continue those, but there are some that do and have incredible programs. And there's some charter schools that have set up some statewide charters. And so we spent a lot of time in one, we did not want to encourage or promote continuing virtual education for everyone, but we would like to continue it for those who thrived, who did better. Once again, it's a small percentage, but so we've been working on it. It was House Bill 1468, which would allow the virtual school option to continue, and the state would continue to fund the virtual students. That bill ended up dying. It was behind the elections bill when the Democrat walkout happened. Unfortunately, it was only counted behind that and died. So that bill right now, where we are now, all these virtual school programs have been stood up. If you weren't one of the original 6 before COVID, you're not going to get funding. So that's very important. I'm working with the governor's office, hopefully to get that added to the call. It was not added so far. But I think there's maybe a misunderstanding. They think we're trying to do it for all students, but we actually had a cap in there that no more. My first initial impression was 5% or 10%, but then I heard from some programs that actually specialize this. They're doing very well, so we were going to talk it up, maybe up to 30% as a cap for non-local students.
Hmm.
So to allow that option, because that's very disappointing. There was another issue having to do with our charter schools, our public school charters. There have been some issues with some location municipalities and stuff kind of working against allowing them to open by using zoning ordinances and stuff against them. There was a bill to prevent that, and that did not pass as well. So there's a couple things that I think would help with a small percentage of our students. But once again, out of that small percentage of students, there's some pretty good family trees out there. We may have some Albert Einsteins out there. He didn't
Right.
do well in a regular traditional classroom, but fortunately, he found a way to get educated. We all benefit from the knowledge that he was able to gain and pass on to future generations. Who knows what kids out there now, what cures they're coming up with if we give them that good opportunity to get an education.
Right, right, absolutely. So you identified, we know that the special session begins tomorrow, and we know it's going to be on the call for the next 30 days. There's a few education matters that have already been assigned by the governor for the next 30 days. And so you would like to see virtual schools added to that call, perhaps this charter school issue that you referenced as
I don't,
well. Is that something else?
I don't know if the charter school will be that. I think that was actually killed in the House, but the virtual education was pretty much an agreed to bill. We'd already worked it all out. The conference committee, I've been working with the author in the House. That was all worked out. It was just a timing issue,
Yeah.
being stuck behind that on the calendar. So that wouldn't take very long to pass it, and I think it's very important. But we'll have an opportunity now that I'm going back to Austin to have a more intense discussion with the governor's office on that.
Yeah. Are there any other education matters that you'd like to see the legislature take up these next 30 days, or any potential future special session, as I hear we may have more than just one on the horizon?
Well, we're definitely going to have one more special session in the fall, and that's for redistricting. But as far as education that we didn't cover this past session, I really think we got some interim studies we're working on. Uh, we're going to continue working on COVID and getting kids caught back up. There's we that's a temporary medical crisis, but we don't want it to become a permanent educational crisis. And some of these kids, depending on what years they're in, they're very critical formative years. And if they miss out on that education, we don't get them caught up very quickly. These are things that could affect the rest of their life. So this is a very serious issue. We'll be spending the interim working on that, and I'm sure we'll still have some more things next session because we have a short window to really get these kids caught back up. Because I'm very concerned, particularly these younger grades. Now, pre-K and kindergarten, a lot of parents just held their kids back a year and they'll bring them in. But we just start about second and third grade. Those are formative years, and we know the importance of learning to read by the end of third grade at grade level. It affects the rest of your academic career because up to third grade you're reading to learn. I'm sorry, you're learning to read, and then from third grade on you're reading to learn. So we miss those milestones. It's very important. Just the brain formation stuff as well. Things that are going on in little young minds that happen in those early years. If you miss those opportunities, it's hard to catch back up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you mentioned interim charges, and for those of us that are joining us that are not as familiar for with this world, that's essentially what your committee will study, will research when it is not in session. And so the impact of COVID-19 on education, that's something that's top of mind for you and your committee.
Right. And just for an example, like we talked about House Bill 3 from the previous session, that arose out of a bill from the session before that. We created a school finance commission. So during the interim, that commission met, and that's where House Bill 3 basically came from. In this last session, we were expecting, you kind of addressed this earlier. We were talking about this was supposed to be, we did education last session. We really were kind of thinking higher ed was going to be the issue for the 87th session because there's a lot of issues there. Obviously, that got pushed back with COVID and all that, but that's still out there. But we did set up a finance commission for community colleges to look at how they're funding, and that will be meeting this interim to try to work on that because these community colleges could be a huge part of how we get these kids and frankly adults back employed, back in good jobs. It used to be you got a high school diploma. There were many jobs out there you could have, but if you look back since the last recession, about 95% of the jobs have been created have gone to people that had something beyond high school. So that's an associate degree, a certification, a 4-year degree, but you've got to have something more than high school. And community college is one of the most efficient and effective ways of getting those, whether it's a certification or an associate's degree or something beyond high school. And we've got 50 of those across the state. Some challenges there in funding and how we do that in a good way for the 21st century. So we'll be looking at that during the interim.
Oh, so then that's will be very similar to the Public School Finance Commission. And
Yes,
next legislative session, we may have some recommendations for y'all to consider and possibly implement in a similar
correct.
way.
Yeah, and like I say, the school finance commission, one of the reasons why it was successful is because it was the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker did an incredible job of picking the members of that commission. It was a very diverse group. It wasn't a one-sided deal trying to push their agenda. It really was, a group of people who came together with the right motives to do the best thing for the future of Texas and for our students. And they were, willing to put aside some differences. And we end up with unanimous recommendations that led to House Bill 3 that I think passed almost unanimously on the House and the Senate floor. So I hope they'll do the same thing again for the Community College Finance Commission.
That's exciting to look forward to see how that continues to develop. As we wrap up in the last couple minutes that we have here, kind of bringing us back to the COVID-19 and the pandemic. There's a lot of discussion during the legislative session about federal funding and education. There are several listening now that may be unfamiliar with the issue. Can you tell us a little, what was this about? So, for example, how much funding are we talking about? What is the funding for? Is it something that's available right now for public schools?
Well, it's a lot of money. If you'll think about when we did House Bill 3 in the 86 session, that was like $11 billion in new money. The feds are sending our public schools about $16 billion. Obviously, that's temporary money, and it should be addressed for immediate needs for getting our students caught up. And then once again, we go back to the tutoring and these accelerated learning. These are the things that should be used to fund those programs, because at the end of this next biennium, that money is not going to be there. They have to spend that money within the next 2 or 3 years. So that money is going to go away. So this isn't the time to build up new programs and that's going to require continued funding. This should be addressed towards meeting students where they are and getting them caught back up to where they need to be, and in whatever ways we can do that. So I'm it's out of our hands at the state level. We did try to do some direction, and there was some state discretionary funding that came with it, but we use that to fund accelerated learning and some of those programs. But I really, we're really going to have to look into our school districts to make sure they spend that money in the right ways and doesn't get wasted. And, unfortunately, you get that kind of money all at one time. Not all of our districts are going to spend it as well as others. And that is a concern that you'd hate to see this opportunity wasted and our students not benefit from these resources coming down.
And as you mentioned, it's a significant amount of money with a very specific purpose of addressing the impact of the pandemic on students and their learning outcomes.
Yeah, and it should not be used for pay raises. Now, you might want to pay people for extra time during this, but pay raises and new positions and adding on to this is not the time and the money to be used for that kind of program. This bit should be used for specific student needs that's on a temporary basis, because at the end of the time that money's gone. And I'll guarantee you right now, you're going to hear we're cutting funding. When this money runs out, you'll hear about cuts in funding. And this is not a cut. This is extra money that came in out of the blue, really. And it just needs to be used in the right way, but it's not going to be a cut when it goes away, other than the fact that unless people try to get used to it and act like it's going to last forever. We don't
So
have that kind of money.
do you expect your committee will perhaps during the interim look and to learn, how are public schools implementing or executing these funds?
I think between us and the TEA, we will be looking very closely at how they spend this money to make sure it's spent in wise ways. And there will be repercussions if people don't do right by that money.
Well, sir, we are at time. I feel that's a very ominous way to end
Well, I'm just saying,
the
I
call.
just, with my strongest encouragement, they need to spend this money in the right ways. And If we find out about wasteful things, there may be repercussions on how much money you get next session from us. Because I mean, I can't stress enough. This money needs to be put in the right place for the right reasons.
which is for
Kids,
students.
students, student outcomes, increasing their educational opportunities, getting them caught up if they're behind because of COVID. And the really sad thing is, the percentage of students who were face to face during this time, unfortunately, our low income areas had the highest virtual school percentages. And the schools in the suburbs that had the highest percentage of people that were face to face. So we know what the gaps now are. It's even worse because of that percentages being off. So we really have to get these kids back face to face and then get them caught up.
Well, sir, I am a big fan of your commitment to students, to education. I, greatly appreciate your time today, the service that you have given to our state. Thank you so much for participating in this discussion and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Well, thank you, Veronica. I hope it was helpful. I appreciate what you guys are doing. Keep up the good work and let me know where I can help.
Thank you, sir. And for all those that listened in today, thank you again. I'm Veronica Garcia. You can register and find out more details about our Good Idea webinar series, including a recording of this episode that we will share with you, sir, and your staff at our website on goodreasonhouston.org/events. Thank you for listening and goodbye, everyone.
All right.
Goodbye,
Bye
Mr.
bye.
Chairman.
Thank you.